In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Tonight is our 17th class of our Orthodox Bible course. We're still in the period of the Renaissance, and I was planning to finish it tonight with these three topics: politics, science, and economics in the Renaissance. If we study carefully our situation today, we come to understand that we live within an interlocking system of politics, science, and its practical application, which is technology, and economics, that is profoundly anti-Christian, anti-Orthodox. In politics, we see complete unscrupulousness, limited by no God-given moral code whatsoever, and dominated by total fakery. Right? It's all theater. One understands that it is simply a facade of legitimate authority covering criminal oligarchical control. That's everywhere. Okay. We see science and technology in the service of the lust for power of the hidden oligarchy, and we have an economic system in which this small oligarchy controls finance in an alchemical way, making money from money and controlling all the wealth, which they use to fund their Luciferian use of technology and to buy the politicians. That's the easy part. This all began in the period we're now studying. Okay, it's only logical that it would have begun in this period, because this is the period when the West decisively breaks with their Christian tradition to establish a new man-created society, a man-centered society. Let's talk about politics in the Renaissance. The textbook of Renaissance politics is, of course, The Prince by Niccolò Machiavelli. Why does The Prince mark a break with previous ideas about government and political power? How does it affect us today? In Christian antiquity and the Middle Ages, in Orthodox societies, it was always understood that all authority comes from God, right? And that a ruler was bound by the law of God and by the organic traditions of his nation. Right? He wasn't above the law. Right? That his rule could be said to be happy if it were conducted virtuously for the benefit of his people. And what is the benefit of the people? In a Christian society, the ultimate benefit is their salvation. Right? So ultimately, the purpose of government was to provide the temporal circumstances in which Christian people could peacefully work out their eternal salvation while attaining the limited earthly happiness that's possible in this life. If the ruler understood and performed his duties in light of God's law, if his people were virtuous and obedient to his legitimate authority, all went well. Of course, God is at the center of this worldview, not man, not man's ambitions. We know, of course, that there were many sinful and brutal and unscrupulous rulers who were supposed to be Christian rulers, right? But everyone understood what the ideal was. Everyone understood what it was supposed to be. Then along comes the Renaissance, in which God is no longer the center of man's concerns, but rather, man is the measure of all things. That's the motto of the Renaissance. Machiavelli's treatise does not actually lay out a political theory per se. He doesn't go deeply into the theological or philosophical foundations of legitimate authority. Machiavelli's treatise is a how-to manual. Okay? The chilling reality is that Machiavelli assumes that his reader, a reader being a politician or a ruler, right, seeks power over others as an egocentric personal ambition. That's taken for granted. Okay. Recall class 15 of our course, in which we quoted Father Seraphim's notes, drawing on Burckhardt's study of the Renaissance concerning the cult of fame, in which the ideal is to leave a name for yourself, to win earthly glory. This is the great motivator for the Renaissance man. Whether he's primarily an artist or an author or a philosopher, a warrior, a musician, a politician, or all of the above. Okay? This was a time of very gifted people, and many of them were all of the above, or at least some of the above. Okay? But their goal is to leave a name for themselves, right? To have power and glory and fame, to be looked up to by their fellow citizens. If you are a Renaissance man who is a ruler, you seek this glory in domination over others. Well, that's our is a misprint there, just in domination. In domination over others. Grabbing as much power as possible and holding on to it. And Machiavelli shows you how to do this in his how-to manual. How to trick people, how to connive, how to lie, right? How to win popularity. It's sort of the politicians, how to win friends and influence people. The methods that Machiavelli advocates include measures that God's law defines as sinful. But he excuses this with the idea that the ends justify the means. Right? The famous idea of the ends justifying the means. Right? So we're on the second page here. For Machiavelli. The ends are not blatantly stated to be egotistical. Remember, all these people are all nominally Christians, including Machiavelli, right? Everyone has to give lip service to the idea that the ruler should concern himself with the good of the people. But the methods that are proposed in The Prince obviously presume that personal ambition is the overriding motive.
But you see, the first one who advocated that was his first one who was publicly advocating. My point is, was it something before that? I mean, those ideas were his own.
No, these ideas, he's putting together ideas. I'm about to point out that these ideas, he's just observing what's going on in the Italian city-states at this time.
But my point is, was it something absolutely new or?
Oh, not absolutely new. I mean, cynical ideas about power go back to the Garden of Eden. But what I'm saying is that Machiavelli marks a turning point from a time dominated by Christian ideas about government to a return, you might say, to anti-Christian.
That's the point.
Yes.
It's a return.
There's nothing new under the sun. And we're going to see later on that this new Atlantis, this new utopia created by these ideas is really a return to something we studied in our course in politics, which is a return to the cult of the pagan god king.
That's my point.
All wrapped up with perverted sexuality, usury, infant sacrifice, and the whole system that we see in front of us today. Okay?
It's a rehash.
It's a rehash. So the Renaissance is a rebirth, all right. It's a rebirth of evil and the destruction of Christian society. Okay. So Machiavelli, in The Prince, there's no reference to God's law or the authority of the church or the ruler being bound by the traditional laws and customs of his nation. But remember, by this time, Christian nations had over 1,000 years of organically developed legal codes based on the gospel. And the rulers were bound by these until they decided that they weren't. And they started using the methods of technological control and the monopoly of coercion, having vast security and military apparatuses where they could impose their personal will on Christian populations in defiance of the laws of the church, but often aided and abetted by the church hierarchy, who were creating new loopholes for them. You see, using casuistic methods to overturn the old canons. Okay. So the ruler is seen as a more or less free agent, seeking as much power as possible within the societal confines of the time. In Machiavelli. Now Machiavelli was a Florentine who lived from 1469 to 1527. He lived, he worked, and he wrote in the ideal laboratory of his own theories, the politics of Renaissance Italy, the Renaissance Italian city-states. They make the ancient Greek city-states look like kindergarten when it comes to intrigue and the lust for power and the machinations of political parties and assassination, poisonings, every subterfuge you can imagine went on in these places. And it was driven by their insane pride, just an insane, overweening pride, both egocentric pride and then pride in their city. For example, there was one city, I think it was Siena, that was landlocked. And in their insane pride, they tried to dig a canal all the way to the sea so they could rival Venice and Genoa and so forth. And they bankrupted their city because it was just insane hubris, right? Pride. The whole culture is driven by hubris. Machiavelli did not have to invent his ideas out of whole cloth. He could observe them in action every day. The political parties, so the princes, the cardinals, the popes, they were all playing this game. Okay. Now, the advanced ideas, so-called, of Renaissance Italy and politics, as in other areas of life, almost all these ideas originally originated in Italy, right? Spread gradually northward, and they infected the rulers of England, France, the Netherlands, and so forth. A book I read years ago that I think is a good case study in the application of Machiavellianism, and it's a very readable book, it's non-technical. It's a classical biography of Thomas More, who was an important English statesman who was executed by the government of Henry VIII because he wouldn't agree to the king being the head of the church. Okay. So Chambers, now More is a controversial character. You could view More as a humanist. He wrote Utopia, and you could view More as strictly as a humanist, or you can view More, probably in his later years, he became more of a reactionary, where he realized all the devils they were unleashing by humanism, and became more of what today would be called a reactionary. But Chambers, who was a Catholic, depicts More as the last representative in England of the old view. And to a great extent this is true, because More is very respectful of the traditional laws of England. That the ruler is bound by the traditional laws, both God's law and man's laws. More's speech at the end of his trial, when he was condemned to be executed, has been preserved word for word. And in it he says that the law that Parliament passed making the king of the head of church is specifically against Magna Carta, signed in 1215, which is considered the foundation of all future English constitutional law, and by the king's coronation oath. So he was very conscious of the customary or organic laws of the nation, which he said the king and Parliament are bound by. Right? But they were saying the opposite. No, the king is and the Parliament are ultimate. They can change the laws at will. Right? So Chambers depicts More as the last representative in England of the old view that the ruler is bound by the traditional laws, okay, God's law and man's laws. Okay, while the courtiers, especially the bureaucrats, and remember, there's a new species of human being now, of these bureaucrats growing up all around like weeds, right, all around the kings of these growing nation states. The bureaucrats on Henry VIII represent the new world of statist absolutism, the divine right of kings, right? Unscrupulous power mongering. Okay, the bad guy in the Henry VIII story is a man named Thomas Cromwell, who is an ancestor. He's not the Cromwell that we think of. We think of Oliver Cromwell, who lived in the 17th century. He's an ancestor or a lateral ancestor of Oliver Cromwell. I forget if he was a direct ancestor or not. Who the man who masterminded the spoliation of all the monasteries. They despoiled what today would be billions of dollars worth of wealth from the monasteries, destroyed countless relics of the saints, destroyed countless churches. And they took all this loot and they put it in the hands of the parasites, the sycophants who were around Henry VIII. Right? So this is Machiavellianism in action. Right? Henry VIII as the prince, the ruler, and then he's got his technocrats, his bureaucrats who go around and scoop up all the wealth and scoop up all the power and concentrate it in the hands of this new powerful government that's above the traditions of the church and the people. So I mentioned Henry VIII as a case study. There are other case studies, but as an Anglo-Saxon, I'm more familiar with the history of England, so that's why I mentioned this case study. But it could be repeated in other histories of Europe, of the other European nations at the time. An interesting footnote is that a younger contemporary of Machiavelli, Martin Luther, gives his princely followers carte blanche to follow Machiavelli's methods. Okay? Many people don't realize that the Protestant princes slaughtered hundreds of thousands of people. Anabaptists, Catholics, others who would not agree to the religion of the state. Okay? And when they went to Luther, Luther just said, well, you're a Christian as a man, but not as a prince. As a prince, you must follow pragmatic methods. Right? This is a famous dictum of Luther. A prince is a Christian as a man, not as a prince. You can separate your Christianity from your methods of rule. We can trace the present-day excuses of politicians who pass sinful legislation while saying, well, personally I'm opposed to such and such, but as a legislator, right, I'm for it, to this dictum of Luther. And remember we studied nominalism a few weeks ago. Luther's favorite philosopher was Occam, who's the father of nominalism. With the Protestant sects in general, we see extremes. Either they make religion a pietistic, subjective, personal thing, like with Luther. Well, that's just your private thing. Religion's your private thing. Okay. Or they try to establish totalitarian utopian communes, as we read in Father Seraphim's notes on Münster and Leiden, as Calvin did in Geneva. Geneva wasn't a commune, but it was certainly a totalitarian theocratic state. Right? In summary, the characteristics of this new philosophy of government include power for its own sake, hypocrisy and lying as ordinary tools of policy. Machiavelli lays it all out. When to lie, when to pretend to be one thing and to really be another. How to convince the people of something when you don't really mean it, and so forth. And complete pragmatism, right? Pragmatism is the idea that all that counts is results. Getting results. All that matters is that you get the results you want, no matter how you get there. Okay. Later on, Enlightenment theorists, the men that were read by the founders of the United States, okay, they were repulsed by the darkness and brutishness of this naked viciousness. This just out there, just so brutal, right? So they tried to replace this approach in European politics by appealing to what they call the natural law, which is actually quite different from the Orthodox or patristic concept of natural law, but by appealing to what they call natural law and the rights of man. Okay, but these are purely abstract concepts. They're not God's law. They're not even traditional human conceptions, so they're doomed to failure. When people today appeal, in America, they appeal to the Constitution, our rights, these efforts are doomed to failure because these are powerless conceptions, right? They don't have any divine power. They don't even have traditional human appeal, right? They're purely abstract ideas. So now, until recently, we here in the West, in America, in Europe, and so forth, we lived in a doublethink universe, which politicians gave lip service to the Enlightenment idea of rights, right? But they actually functioned according to Machiavellianism. They're really just being a bunch of Machiavellians. Okay? But today, now they're dropping the mask. They're not even pretending. They're not even pretending to be liberals, right? They're just preaching overt evil as the new orthodoxy, and they're imposing it by coercion. Okay? Okay, so the Enlightenment delusion of rights is dead. Nobody, except for a few professors at Hillsdale College or a few people in the John Birch Society, everybody understands the Constitution is dead, right? Liberalism is dead, and we live in this world of the naked force of coercion of the new orthodoxy of anti-Christian, Luciferianism.
And it's enforced by murder.
By murder, assassination, murder, genocide. So, yeah.
The Bill of Rights, or the first two amendments, which are the most known,
most quoted, most known,
most quoted,
mm-hmm.
that make American, what they say, exceptional.
Yes.
Why do you think they don't have any power or any value?
There are people.
The second one is the right to bear
take
arms.
away right to bear arms. Yes.
And the first one is the
freedom of speech.
Freedom of speech.
Right, and those are most under attack. I'm not saying that they don't have some power. Of course, there are very sincere people fighting a good rearguard action, quoting the Constitution, quoting the First Amendment, quoting the Second Amendment. I'm not saying that they have no power at all. They don't have ultimate power. They don't have the divine power of God's law. See, if they're based, to the extent they're based on Enlightenment theories about human rights. Now there are, if you base the freedom of speech and the right to bear arms on Orthodox theology, which you could, then, and if it goes with a spiritual conversion, and the sanction of the church, then those ideas do take on power. I'm not saying that everything in the American Constitution is based strictly on these Enlightenment ideas. The American Constitution is very complex, and it's based on not only Enlightenment ideas, but the organic development of the Anglo-Saxon Constitution, going back to Orthodox times, which are influenced by the laws of the church. Okay, so what's needed if we wanted to save our American Constitution, what's needed ultimately is a conversion of the constitutional ideals to an expression of entirely scriptural, and entirely patristic and orthodox moral and political concepts. And you could certainly, in there, certainly a certain amount of freedom of speech, and certainly the right to defend yourself, to defend your home against an invader, to defend yourself against attackers included, obviously. So I'm not saying that the Bill of Rights, for example, is a completely pagan document or a completely rationalistic document. It couldn't have been, because people are more complicated than that. All the founding fathers of the United States weren't just Masons or just Enlightenment theorists. They're also the heirs of 1,800 years of Christian tradition. See, so it's much more complex than that. So I didn't mean to say that the Constitution is dead in the sense that it could not be revived or Christianized. Just saying that if you conceive of it as strictly an expression of Enlightenment political theory about human rights, this doesn't have the power to save. For example, the whole fight against abortion. They're always saying rights, the right to be born, the right to life. Okay, and this ultimately is powerless because it's missing the whole point, which is the church's laws regarding the family. You can't. Once you say the right of the baby and you pit it against the right of the mother, you're already in that adversarial Darwinian world of the survival of the fittest, of the law of the jungle, the individual, a war of omnes contra omnes, right? Everybody against everybody else. Okay, but if you start with the family and God's laws for marriage, for sexuality, for childbearing, for child rearing, then you have a solid basis on which to say that abortion is absolutely heinous and against God's law. You see. So anyway, no, don't get me wrong. I'm totally for the right to own guns, and I'm totally against.
But they are doing it nowadays. I mean, I know against the First Amendment, right? They are banning a lot of conservative speakers.
Exactly. What I'm saying is
they go to Berkeley University and they cannot have a speech.
They're enforcing their new orthodoxy. See, that's why it's a mistake to call them liberals. They're not liberals. A liberal would say, I disagree with you, but I want you to speak. They're saying, we have a new orthodoxy. The devil is God, and you must be silent. See? Or else. The problem is that a liberal polity is always temporary. Remember, I said much earlier in our course, I talked about the problem with republics. Okay, republics can only exist in like a laboratory situation where you have a small country, a citizenry that's highly educated, highly virtuous, and racially, linguistically, and religiously homogeneous, and that has an aristocracy generations old, bred to public service. In such a condition, a republic can exist. Okay? But otherwise, the entire experience of mankind is that the default position of mankind is to be ruled by some kind of imperial or monarchical authority. And the only question is whether that monarch is going to be an open monarchy sanctioned by God and by legitimate laws and customs, or whether it's going to be a hidden authoritarian rule of an oligarchy or some kind of a hidden or secret force that's manipulating the appearance of government to control the people. Remember, we talked about in our course in political theory, we talked about Aristotle's distinctions, okay, of tyranny, monarchy versus tyranny, and aristocracy versus oligarchy, and democracy versus ochlocracy, the rule of the crowd. Okay. Plato accurately pointed out that all democracies degenerate rapidly into dictatorships or to tyrannies. Democracy is always a chimera. It's always a lie, basically. In modern times, democracy is invariably in modern times democracy is used as a tool or as an excuse of a criminal oligarchy to destroy traditional authority. And that's why the American founding fathers didn't even use the word democracy. There's another lie, another brainwashing job that's been done, is that since World War II, the word democracy is constantly used, since the Franklin Roosevelt administration. The word democracy is constantly used about the American political system, whereas the founding fathers envisioned the American political system as a republic, not a democracy. In a republic, there's delegated authority from a limited suffrage, a limited number of voters, delegated authority to people operating according to an agreed-upon constitution, which they cannot disobey. Right? And but this hasn't existed in the United States really since the end of the Civil War. We're just living out, But so I'm not totally against the philosophy expressed in the American Constitution, except, but we have to recognize it's a very limited document because it's not based on orthodoxy. It's not based on the wisdom of the scriptures and the fathers. So
nowadays, nothing is based on orthodoxy.
Exactly right. No, nothing is. That's right. Nothing is.
I'm not about Russia. I don't think Putin is having anything.
No. Russia is a secular society in which the official church is viewed by the government as a powerful force for national cohesion. At best, Putin and Patriarch Kirill are perennialists. They believe that all traditional religions are fundamentally equal, and that it's good to have a traditional religion rather than be crazy neoliberals like the West. Or at least that's their selling point.
But he was very strong against building a mosque in Moscow, from what I...
He doesn't... they've allowed Muslims in Moscow to... The genius of the Russians, that they've held their empire together by letting the people in their own countries, Uzbekistan or whatever, have their own culture to a limited extent. But it's always understood the Russians are in charge. See? The Russians accuse the Americans of being racists, right? But actually the reality in Russia is that the Russians keep their minorities under control. Anyway, that's another story. I don't want to get it. We're getting kind of we're getting off topic here. So that's for Machiavelli. Okay. Science and technology. Just as Pico della Mirandola's Oration on the Dignity of Man can be said to be the manifesto of the Renaissance in general, and Machiavelli's The Prince is the classic statement of Renaissance politics, one could say that Francis Bacon's utopian novel New Atlantis and his works on the role of science and technology in society, such as The New Organon. Bacon wrote a lot, so these are just two big examples. Okay. Form the charter of modern scientism. What is scientism? You often hear people say, if you don't believe in evolution, for example, or you don't believe in cloning, people say, are you against science? I say, well, no, I'm not against science. Right? What I'm against is the manipulation of science, or the falsification of science, or the misuse of science and technology to break God's law, or to pretend to perfect society. This idea that science, and then science's outcome, which is technology, applied science, technology, right, can perfect society. Man can perfect life on earth by scientific and philosophic advancement. In the internet, if you look in the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the author, who's a scholar at DePaul University, says he died in 1626, leaving behind a cultural legacy that, for better or for worse, includes most of the foundation for the triumph of technology and for the modern world as we currently know it. It's quite a claim.
For better or worse.
For better or for worse, yeah. Well, he put in for better or for worse, So who was Bacon? He was a classic Renaissance man, right? A statesman, a philosopher, a jurist, a scientist, an author. He lived during the reigns of Elizabeth I and James I of England. There are various theories about his involvement with occult sects, like the Freemasons and Rosicrucians. Of course, the problem is you can never prove these things. right? Because the nature of an occult sect is that they're always hiding themselves, right? So, but there's a lot of circumstantial evidence, of course. And then if you read the writings themselves, in New Atlantis is really a picture of a society ruled by a secret society. Okay? People like Rosicrucians or like Freemasons or Illuminati, right? So, but you don't have to prove his official, formal connection to these groups to understand his fundamental idea. His famous phrase in Meditationes Sacrae, that knowledge itself is power. Okay? The real power in a Baconian society is held by the people who know the secrets of science. Got the secret fire, right? The Promethean fire, and they've got a lock on it, right? In New Atlantis, the real power in Ben Salim, okay, that's Hebrew, right, for a son of peace, Ben Salim, is the utopian island realm. But the real power is not in the hands of the official government. It's in the hands of a secret society of scholars who form the College of Solomon's House. Okay, now people trying to discuss whether Bacon was a Mason say, well, Solomon is this figure that's very important in Masonic mythology, is the architect, right? The king who's the architect. Right? So that's interesting that he called his College of Scholars Solomon's House. And they deliberately withhold knowledge from the rulers. So they're the real rulers. Okay? The father of Solomon House states, and this we do also. This is from the book. Okay? These are Bacon's words. This we do also. We have consultations which of the inventions and experiences which we have discovered shall be published, and which not. And we all take an oath of secrecy for the concealing of those which we think fit to keep secret. Though some of those we do reveal sometime to the state, and sometimes not. Okay. So this is his idea of a perfect society, utopian society. It's ruled by this group of people who are discovering things but not telling the king about them. But they reveal them when they want to, you see, for their own purposes.
Does he say how they get that knowledge? It's another one.
Another one, yes. Well, the title of the book is New Atlantis. Where are the Atlanteans, in the myth of Atlantis, where they get the knowledge? From the demons.
Exactly.
Right? So this idea is completely consonant with the idea that we saw earlier in our study of the Renaissance, that science is linked to occult knowledge. Right? The foundations of modern science are wrapped up with alchemy and astrology. Pico della Mirandola, the philosopher who's the ideologue of the Renaissance, advocated a syncretistic philosophy based on the Bible, Kabbalah, and magic. Right? And della Mirandola is the ideologue of the Renaissance. They all look to him for their fundamental ideas about the purposes of science, the purposes of politics, the structure of society. Okay. So it's being proposed by Bacon in New Atlantis, or rather depicted, he's depicting it, here it is, right? Is that a secret oligarchy with the keys to scientific knowledge and technology should also hold the keys to political power, which they dole out as they will to the state, which is no longer the true governing power. The state can only make use of the tools that the ones with the secret knowledge give them, right? The state has become like an interface, as we say nowadays, for the real governing power, which is occult and irresponsible. That is, it's hidden and has no accountability. Okay. It is rather obvious how this applies to our situation today, right? In which today only extremely fatuous people, or people, I guess, people who watch CNN or Fox News or something, and believe everything they see. They still believe that our political institutions are not puppets manipulated by an irresponsible oligarchy through technocratic methods of control. That's what's going on. We have an oligarchy. They have the leverage. They hold the wealth, the vast majority of the wealth, right? And these technocratic methods of control, but they interface with the public through this theater of politics. Okay. whose constitutional processes and functions, at least at the higher levels, have been completely supplanted. I'm not saying that on the local level one of the beauties Mr. Welch, who founded the John Birch Society, often pointed out that one of the beauties of the American system, the wisdom of the American system, is that it has many levels of defenses. So actually, I in my own life, I experience how at the local level, the functions of our government still go on. That actually, the government you see is the government that you get. Okay, but the higher up you go, the less and less that's true. And at the highest levels, it's really difficult to conceive of how a man could become a U.S. congressman or senator and not seriously compromise Christian faith or his morality in order to serve the oligarchy. So the Orthodox Christian concept of the roles of science and technology is this. The Orthodox concept is this. In the Orthodox or patristic mindset, what's the role of science and technology? Okay. The primary role of science is to adorn man's mind with knowledge, right? In order to inspire the contemplation of God and His creation, right? To lead us up, right? Anagogi, to lead us up to higher knowledge. Right? The role of technology is to help man find the moderate amount of earthly happiness he needs in order to practice virtue. Right? Not an unending, endless amount of greater and greater ease or comfort or power, but a moderate amount of earthly happiness, right? To avoid excessive earthly sorrows on the one hand, while avoiding excessive earthly joys on the other hand, both of which conduce to vice, right? Being very wealthy or very poor, right, are conducive to vice. It's in the middle, in medio stat virtus, right? Having a sufficiency. So the role of technology is to help us help our brother to get through life without being unduly tempted by sorrows or by pain or by afflictions. Okay. There is no room in the Orthodox concept for unlimited technological progress. Just like there's no room for unlimited personal wealth. When the Church says that man has a right to private property, she doesn't mean unlimited personal wealth, which can only be acquired at the expense of other people, right? So unlimited technological progress is a quintessentially Luciferian idea. Okay? It's linked to heretical utopian ideas of human perfectibility, what we see in Bacon. The Baconian or New Atlantis ideal is quite different from orthodoxy. There's a high priesthood of scientists and scholars operating in secret. They're going to discover truths. They're going to perfect society and earth.
Well, I have a question.
Yes.
So, Holy Fathers or patristics, they were, bottom line, they were out of the world. I mean, most of them were kind of hesychas.
Well, actually, the ones
which are the one who are
the famous theologians or great fathers were bishops of cities. They were officials of the Roman government. We're talking about Saint Basil or Saint John Chrysostom. We're talking about people like Saint Gregory the Great of Rome. These are people intensely involved with the society. Now they were the amazing thing is they were also practicing constant inner prayer and so forth and poverty, but they were intensely concerned. Saint Basil wrote a great deal about wealth and poverty, and about Christian economics. And that he wrote a lot about our seeing ourselves as stewards. Our wealth is from God, and God wants man to own property. Remember, we read about the last right in Richard Weaver about the importance of owning property, right? So the Church wants men to own property as the best setting in which to practice virtue, right? To feed your family, to be free of coercion and want and so forth. But the Church always teaches her children to see themselves as stewards of their property. So they're stewards. Okay, so that we're always concerned with the needs of our brother, and if we're practicing Christian virtue, seeing our property as stewards, and we're under the guidance of the church, of our spiritual father and so forth, then we can use our wealth wisely. And without coercion, without revolutions and Bolsheviks and so forth taking away our property, we freely and joyously steward our property to help our brother. Okay. But the idea of course, all the people who sponsored Bolshevism didn't really care about the poor, as we know, right? That was an excuse to steal the property of all the people, rich and poor, and concentrate it in themselves. And no earthly revolution, no earthly program based on coercion is going to create justice or economic equality. And economic equality is not even a Christian ideal. Just that everyone should have what he needs to practice to have a life of virtue. But the Holy Fathers, who were primarily involved in dogmatic controversies, were for the most part not isolated. They were for the most part bishops. Saint Photius, for example, was a member of the imperial court before he became patriarch. They were to various extents. They were all involved. All these great dogmatic fathers we think about were actually part of the Roman governing class, which are all highly educated civic figures who are deeply involved in governmental, economic, social issues of their time. So it'd be interesting. We could do a whole. We had a course in politics. We should have a whole session on economics, really to talk about some of these things.
I'm reading this book, Ervegetinos.
Ervegetinos, yes.
And because Father Ștefan Nuțescu from Mount Athos, the Romanian, he's quoting a lot from the book, and they all talk only about this, like about the monks to get away from the world. Don't get involved with regular people. Don't because in this way you're going to lose your salvation.
Well, for most of the monks that's true, and that's why they say monks flee two kinds of people: women and bishops, because the women want to marry them and the bishops want to make them priests. But paradoxically, monks who've attained high levels of holiness are also called from the monastery, and they do become bishops. And the difficulty is in finding a bishop who is both remains a man of prayer and is a good, active pastor. That's really a rare gift, if you think about it. And so most bishops, even good, say, I'm not talking about the criminal and heretical and bad bishops, even good bishops are some, very rarely are they a perfect combination of the two.
I was trying to make a point, which is probably false, that somewhat orthodoxy is somewhat limited towards, or somewhat limits a man towards this idea of making him going towards science or technology, or thinking that that's going to be for him like a waste of time in a way.
Yeah, but that's
taking him from prayer.
Well, that's
and I have the feeling that Orthodox countries somewhat lost the competition or whatever with the the Western world.
Well, yes, this is the great challenge. When the Orthodox nations are coming to existence in the 19th century, after years of Ottoman rule, or Russia trying to fight for its existence against the Swedes and the Catholics and the Tatars and so forth. How do you take advantage of the genuinely amazing achievements of the Western Europeans without losing the soul of the Orthodox people? You have to compete. Now, Peter the Great, again, as you know, I'm not a fan of Peter the Great, right? There are volumes of criticism of Peter the Great for how he destroyed a monastery, persecuted the old believers, so forth and so on. But he was dealing with a real problem, which is that he had to bring his society up to the technological and military standards of the Western Europeans and the Turks in order to survive. So how do you do that and remain Orthodox? Right? It can be done. With God's grace, these things can be done. Right? To some extent, he turned away from God. And God rest his soul. God have mercy on his soul. God will judge him, right? This is a genuine problem. And our Orthodox nations did not solve this problem by the time of the 20th century revolutions. And so any future for Orthodox nations on earth is going to be coming to grips with this. How do you have this? But it can be done because with God all things are possible. And actually true wisdom is found in the scriptures and the fathers in prayer and true science. And one good thing, that people make fun of the evangelicals and the fundamentalists in America, but they've done some of those men have done real serious scientific work, writing articles showing that the evidence of geology, biology, and astronomy and so forth support and do not contradict Genesis. That's why Father Seraphim Rose quotes on them and refers to them in his book on Genesis. Yeah. So this is all serious work that Orthodox people have to do. And it is a mistake for Orthodox people to just say, go pray and say your prayer rope and ignore everything else. It doesn't matter. So what they really do, but they really don't do that. They really don't just say their prayer rope. They really go off and have their private little prayer life, but then the rest of the week they're just buying into the system. And they're just living the modern life. And the hard thing is to actually engage the world and try and really challenge the existing values and challenge the pseudo-orthodoxy, the new orthodoxy of political correctness and so forth and so on. And there's a lot of work to be done, spiritual work, intellectual work, all kinds of work to be done in this. Now that doesn't mean we here, our little group in Rochester Hills, we're not going to solve all these problems, but it's important to recognize these things. It is good that in the 20th century and now in the 21st century there's been a revival of interest in hesychasm, the spiritual teachings of the Desert Fathers, and so forth and so on. But we have to pay also attention to the philosophic and dogmatic works of the Fathers and how they dealt with philosophic questions about economics, about government, about creation, and so all these issues. They did deal with these things. Okay, it's just that's not popular now because those things actually challenge the establishment. Whereas if you just go off in a corner and say your prayer rope, and don't worry about what the bishops are doing, don't worry about the government's doing, just go off and say your prayer rope. Mm-hmm. Well, that's all fine and good, but they would love for you to think like that. Right, because then you don't challenge them. There's no prophetic witness of the church against the evils and against the false ideas that are going on. So we have to, without being foolish, without being brash or hubristic, we do have to, in our own quiet way, we have to prophetically challenge the values of the society. Okay, a very bad phenomenon in Orthodoxy are these elders who just are popular, but they justify what the patriarchs are doing in ecumenism. So they've abandoned their prophetic role. They're not true elders because they've abandoned their prophetic role. They've betrayed Christ. So I don't care if they say 1,000,000 Jesus prayers. They don't have the guts to stand up to the establishment. And if you look at the Old Testament and throughout the history of the church, every true prophet, every person who speaks the truth, he's viciously persecuted and destroyed, not just by the Turks or by Muslims or Jews or whatever, destroyed by the authorities, by the church authorities. So anyway, that's a side. I'm sorry, that's a long response to what you were saying, but it's a big issue. Okay, we've finished talking about science and technology. Let's talk about economics. The bedrock foundational idea of Christian economics is that usury, lending money while charging interest, is a grave sin. Usury is a sin. Okay. Christian ecclesiastical and civil codes, East and West, forbade Christians to practice usury, which is why most usurers in Christian societies, prior to the period we are studying, were Jews. But because Jews were always excluded, until modern times, Jews were excluded from positions of influence in the pre-modern Christian societies, from the government, the military, education, medicine, and so forth. And because the laws against usury practiced by Christians were strictly enforced, and because the need for having large amounts of money ready to hand is limited in primarily agrarian societies. Okay? People didn't need large amounts of cash suddenly, right, to carry on the business of life, right? Money lending and debt never dominated economics prior to the modern period. It existed, but it was kept under tight control by Christian rulers and by the church. It was always understood that putting someone else into debt is a predatory action. Money lending and debt creation is a form of warfare for the destruction of other people and to apprehend their property. That's what it is. Okay? It's a sin. Okay? Now, even prior to the civil liberties being granted to the Jews living in Christian countries, which really didn't happen until the 19th century, right? Usury entered Western Christian society directly through the rise of Christian-owned banks during the Renaissance. Okay, first in Italy and later in Austria and other European nations. The popes, using casuistic arguments such as Leo X, who reigned from 1513 to 1521, began allowing for usury in various circumstances. Okay. It is quite significant that the trigger for the Lutheran revolt, the sale of indulgences, and that's the whole story supposedly behind Luther's revolt, the sale of indulgences, right, was authorized, but the sale of indulgences was authorized by Leo X to pay for the interest on loans taken out from Catholic bankers in Austria who were financing the building of the new St. Peter's that we talked about last time. Now, there's a Roman Catholic writer, Michael Hoffman, who documents this whole process in this book about usury. Very interesting book. It's, the Catholics have a whole mythology that the Protestants created money lending and usury and capitalism and so forth and so on. But he quotes all these Protestant, especially in America, these Puritan preachers who are just railing against usury. So it's not just a Protestant problem, and it's not just a Jewish problem. It's a sinful problem. It's a problem of sinful man, right? The new Machiavellian technocratic rulers of Europe began financing their ever larger military and technological enterprises through borrowing money. And thus the money power, the bankers and financiers, whether Jewish or Gentile or Masons or whatever they were, over the centuries gained more and more power over the modern European nation-states and their vast overseas empires. They put them in debt. They had their hands around their necks. Okay. Usury fits in perfectly with the alchemical view of science and technology. What's alchemy? The quest to get something for nothing. To turn base metal into gold. Right? Usury is a magic way to increase your wealth, not by work, but by a trick.
Like stock market.
The whole thing is like the casino. It's the casino, but the bankers own the casino and they rig the roulette table. See? Ultimately, like Machiavellian politics and knowledge as power, scientism, it's all about power, getting power over other people. That's what usury is. It's getting power over other people. It's a form of warfare. That's why the tractates in the Talmud tell the Jews, practice warfare against the Goyim by getting them in debt, right? You destroy people's substance. You steal their land. It doesn't matter. You don't have an army. You don't even have the Jews until 1948 didn't have their own country. But they could conquer whole nations. And they understood this. You see? To them it was obvious. It should be obvious to us, right? That usury is predatory. It's a form of destroying someone. At the beginning of the period we're studying, back in 1300, Dante puts usurers and sodomites in the same circle of hell. Because sodomites take what is naturally fertile and make it sterile. They take the procreative power and they make it sterile, right? While usurers take what is naturally sterile, money, and they make it breed. In Greek, we call usury tokos, the product of birthing. It's sort of like sarcastic, call it tokos, right? Breeding, money breeding itself. By the end of this period, this was mere theory. Between 1300, then you arrive at 1600, and this has all changed. Christian European economics were increasingly dependent. Christian European economies were increasingly dependent on usury, sanctioned by the popes and by the Catholic and Protestant princes. Okay? And the princes were the biggest customers, because they're trying to finance these huge professional armies. And by military technology, they were in an arms race. Right? And an arms race that started, in the late Middle Ages, and it's still going on now. It's just today's just an extension of the same thing. Right? Constantinople fell partially because a Hungarian Christian sold cannon to the Turks. Right?
Yes.
Emperor Constantine couldn't afford to buy the cannon, so the Hungarians sold it to the Turks. And there were even Western European observers in the Turkish army who were helping the Turks sight the cannon. Okay? It's like a game for them. Okay. In Orthodox economics, this is the Orthodox understanding, okay, the Christian understanding. Means of production, whether it's a farm or a factory, a shop, whatever it may be. Okay? Productive wealth, your means of production. They exist to serve man, whose eternal salvation is the concern of the government. Right? In the Christian government, we're always concerned with man's salvation. So even though as a government, as a king or a ruler or a governor, a mayor, whatever, I'm not the priest. I'm not directly concerned with his spiritual welfare, but my decisions about his temporal welfare, about property ownership, about production, about currency, about finance, are governed by my concern for my brother's salvation. And I do my part. The church does her part, but I do my part for my brother's salvation. What does my brother need? Does he need a farm? Does he need his own shop? Does he need to be debt-free? These are my concerns, because I love my brother. Right? So the concern of rulers should be the salvation of their subjects. Means of finance, getting hold of money, getting hold of an investment, something to start your business or to buy your house. They exist to serve production. Okay? So you have man and his spiritual needs on top, and then the means of production, the factory, the farm, whatever it may be, and then the bank, down lowest on the totem pole, right? Under control, with a limited role. Okay. In Luciferian economics, man serves production, right? The slave working in the factory. Production serves finance, the factory owner being afraid of the banker because he can't get a loan. Right? And the bankers rule everybody. And they don't do a lick of work. Not work with their hands, not work with their minds, nothing. They're tricksters, they're criminals. Okay? The alchemical, perverted economics of usury fuels the Promethean quest for unlimited technological progress. So now we have cloning, and now we have transhumanism. In the service of an occult oligarchy of the money power, who use their army of technocrats, the managerial class, and their monopolistic control of education, medicine, communications media, and monopoly of the violent means of coercion. That's why they want to take away the guns. So they can have a monopoly on violence to enslave the human race. And thus is born the new Atlantis. So I wonder what Bacon would think of his project now.
He'll be happy.
I guess so.